Welcome to Quranomics. I am Qadi Tayyib Azdi, and today's article is titled The Original Story of Sahih Al Bukhari, and it is written by the author Sameh Askar. Here I present to you new information that, if placed with the old, will help researchers in creating a complete picture in the mind of what happened in the past and how this book was formed, and most of all, how it became the faith of a nation. First, Al Bukhari has historically proven that he was born and died in Uzbekistan, and this country in the past used to speak Al Khwarizmic language that has been extinct since the 10th century, and it was written in the past with the Aramaic letter and later replaced with the Arabic letter, meaning that Al Bukhari was speaking a Khwarizmic language with an Arabic letter, similar to when a Pakistani speaks Urdu but writes with an Arabic letter, or a Persian speaks in Persian and writes with an Arabic letter. And since Al Bukhari lived in the 9th century, he was practically speaking phonetically Al Khwarizmi, and later his book Sahih Al Jami' was translated into Arabic. And this raises a question on the nature of the translator and his honesty in transmitting text, as well as the role of Aramaic and Al Khwarizmi / Turkish language in the formation of the doctrine of Al Bukhari. Al Khwarizmi language has a simplified definition in Wikipedia in the Cyrillic letters, which are similar to the language of the Uzo Khwarizm or Euro Khwarizm, all of which are sub-languages within Uzbekistan. They all belong to the culturally known Aryan group Indo-European, meaning that speakers of Turkish, Iranian, and Russians know it, but Arabs do not. And this explains the absence of any information about the languages of Al Khwarizm in the Arabic content about the network. A questioner might ask, what is the relationship between Al Bukhari speaking and Al Khwarizmi language with his book? And the answer is that this is an extinct language and is no longer written, and information about it is almost non-existent internationally. And Al-Bukhari's hadith about it and the ancient society of Uzbekistan means that the opportunity to translate his book Sahih al-Jami' is available only in the first 2 centuries after the death of Al-Bukhari, at most, due to the absence of translators. Those who are interested in that language, unlike Persian and Urdu, for example, which can be translated now easily, and therefore Sahih al-Bukhari, had it not reached the Muslims of Arabia before the extinction of the original language, then what has actually reached the Muslims is another different book or correction of the original. And the meaning of correction is that there have been additions, deletions, and modifications to the original to match the translator's whims. And for whom says that Al-Bukhari spoke Arabic, there is no evidence for that historically. On the contrary, it is proven that the peoples of that region were speaking Al-Khwarizmi Turkish, which with the testimony of travelers. The Arab traveler Ahmad bin Fadlan, who lived in the 4th century after Hijrah, that's equivalent to 10th century Christian era, and in his book on his travels in the countries of the Turks and the Saklabs, he mentioned that he used Turkish translators to deal with the peoples of that region because Arabic was not that common. Even if we suppose that the claims of the jurist is correct, that the tongue of the Bukhari is Arabic by acquiring and learning, in addition to the difficulty of proving that due to its scarcity evidence. Al-Bukhari's book itself literally is a brief narration of different ideas and stories about details and explanations of the weakness of of Ibn Hanbal, for example, in his Musnad, which is a difference that writers note in that the writers of Al Bukhari were more eloquent and concise, and this would not have happened without the passage of time. The original book has several translations, 13 of them. There were 13 different versions of Bukhari's book from the students of the students of the students. Okay, they did not find a linguistic equivalent to the original, so they translated it with the meaning. That means not verbatim, not word for word. Just whatever writer thought this was the correct meaning, then he would just write it down. This affected the psychologically in the minds of the Arab Sunni jurists later, as they inherited a book eloquent and close to their languages in which they grew up in schools, while keeping the lack of access. The first Arabic translator of the Sahih, which he certainly transmitted from the Turkish was Al-Farbari. And sure, the scholar Al-Farbari, in the science of translations, linguistic eloquence is only owned by native speakers. The translator is always less eloquent than the original speaker unless Al-Bukhari, Superman language, or Arabic language genius, and this has not been proven in his history that he was a linguist or was rumored to have accomplished anything in it. Second, the story in the book. In the introduction to Fath al-Bari by Ibn Hajar al-Asqalani, we read that Ishaq Ibrahim al-Mustali said, I copied the book of al-Bukhari from its original, which was with its owner Muhammad ibn Yusuf al-Farbari. So I saw in it things that were not done and things that were bleached, including in them there are no translations after which nothing has been proven, and among them are hadiths for which were not translated. So we added some of that to some others. Fath al-Bari, that's 1:8. The meaning of the words of al-Mustali is that the authentic original al-Bukhari was with another person named al-Farbari, and this man is from Turkmen, who published Sahih Al Bukhari and claimed to Muslims that he read it from Al Bukhari personally. And therefore, in fact, Sahih Al Bukhari is, speak and claim, actually this person's name, Al Farbari. And why? There was no origin for Sahih Al Bukhari with someone other than this man. That means no one else had a copy but this guy. And this guy is the one who published it under al-Bukhari's name. And al-Farbari, because his Turkmenship or his Turkish nationality, he understood the language of al-Khawarizm, affiliated with the state al-Khawarizmiya, which the Mongols later eliminated. And therefore, the correct translation was from him or someone who knew him. And when the Salafis and the hadith narrators learned of that calamity, they only had to trust Al-Farbari and give him the attribute, thus trust, to attach a book, Al-Bukhari, with it. They had no other choice. And because the origin, subject, and essence and holiness of the Sahih, and the entire doctrine of the Sunnah regarding and dependent on it, they have no choice but to document it. Otherwise, there would be no Sunni religion. So, because this Farbari was the only source, and there was no other person who had this copy that would claim that he had, and no other source, and he claimed its authenticity. The Salafis in the Middle East, in that Iraq or the Levante or the desert, they had no other choice but to take it, because this book was their savior. They built their religion based on this book, plus, and it was a block on top of the block of what Al-Imam al-Shafi'i built. He's the founder of He's the founder of the Sunni religion, but Al Bukhari was like the cornerstone. Is that's where they get everything from. That's their well of water. So now, thirdly, Al Bukhari was a person, Asian Turkey, is dominated by the physical characteristics of the Turks, which are closest to the Mongols and the Uyghurs. And these are the ancestors of the first Ottomans who inhabited Anatolia and formed what is known as the modern Republic of Turkey. And its jurisprudential and political status was obtained in the era of the Abbasid Khalifa al-Mutawakkil in God, who was also of Turkish descent from his mother's side. The Turks are similar to the Mongols and the Uyghurs, so the relationship between al-Bukhari and al-Mutawakkil was national linguistic, and for the reason that al-Mutawakkil, Mutawakkil's mother, whose name is Courageous, is one of those loyalists of the Turk, which Muslims acquired from the conquest of Uzbekistan in the Umayyad era. So the passion for the Turkish lineage of al-Mutawakkil overcame him, and he began to establish the era of the loyal Turks who ruled throughout the second Abbasid era. The question is, what is the relationship between al-Bukhari's race and gender with his knowledge? Answer. This region in Central Asia had a nomadic culture, not urban, and the descendants who founded the first marine Mamluk state, which was characterized by conquest, pillage, and plunder. That was in the year 1250, and an authentic trait in the later Ottoman Turkish families. This happened to be. So the story is not gender and race, but rather culture. And this explains how al-Bukhari's doctrine transferred without reason. This is basically the culture of the desert Bedouins, and it is the dominant characteristics of the desert Bedouins, Arabic and African, except for what is rare. And it may be said, how is it that how is that and Bukhara was the homeland of the Hanafis sect and are the people of reason in the time of al-Bukhari? That was the headquarters there. I said the rational Hanafi school, the first one, the old one, the first generation, was over with the death of Abu Hanifa in the year 150 after Hijrah in Iraq. That is 44 years before Bukhari's birth. Because with him, the originality of al-Hanafi school ended and started another phase. And those who witnessed al-Bukhari from among the Hanafis were the people of Hadith who influenced the Hanafis later until the appearance of Imam al-Maturidi in the 4th century after Hijrah. This Islamic, when I say after Hijrah, that's Islamic calendar, who restored a large part of the rationality of Abu Hanifa of the doctrine. The importance of mentioning gender and race is not just context only, but also to export a correct image of al-Bukhari in the minds of Muslims that he was not a resemblance. He was not a resemblance to them, and that his ethnic, linguistic, and physical origins were different. And in psychology, the shape plays a major role. So in psychology, the shape plays a major role in acceptance. And these traits correspond to self-affiliation, exclusivity, and the delusional belief in excellence. And this can be seen in the different images of Christ, peace be upon him, among the peoples. The Africans imagine him as black, and the Europeans imagine him as white and Scandinavian, and some Middle Eastern Christians imagine him as a race Semitic and Middle Eastern. But because the first historical image of Jesus appeared in the era of the Byzantine, the official image of Christ was established in a white Greek form that was circulated to churches. From the previous, it is clear that Al Bukhari attained his sanctity in his time by politics mixed with race and language, and that he did not write Sahih Al Jami'. It was lost. In fact, because the Turks do not believe in classification and the pen, but in memorization and repetition, and that the Imam Al-Farbari, the Turkman, was the one who took over this task by translating Sahih al-Jami' from Al-Khwarizmi, which is the local language of the Uzbeks, is the Turkish language of the tribes who they were later known as Oghuz or Yurghuz, who were later known as Turkmen. Then Imam al-Farbari was of multicultural or language of Turkey, understood the language of Khwarizm before its extinction, and that this translator was not honest in conveying the words of al-Bukhari when his book appeared in complete, bleached, white pages and hadith incomplete and disarray. And whoever claimed to say that Al-Farbari was honest, I say to him, how is the pages and the hadiths are incomplete while he claims at the same time that he heard the hadith from Al-Bukhari? Contradiction. This means that Al-Farbari was adding and removing text as he wishes. If he heard a hadith or it was firmly established in his mind, he writes it completely, whether in words or meaning, but that the pages of the book remain white and his hadiths are incomplete, this only means that there is an unfinished work due to the death of the translator and the absence of him who is supposed to fill these gaps, which is Ibn Hajar testified to. And the clearest example of this forgery, well, was mentioned in Sahih Al-Jami' itself, that Al-Bukhari put it as a narrator of a chain of narrators and not a book compiler, where he said, Muhammad ibn Yusuf al-Farbari told us, and Muhammad ibn Ismail al-Bukhari told us. He said, Ubaidullah bin Musa told us on the authority of Sufyan, who said, if it is recited to the muhaddith, the narrator, then there is no harm in it. If he says he told me or relayed to me, or in other words, that person relayed what he heard to others, Sahih al-Bukhari, chapter on knowledge. And the question is, who told who? It's not specified. It's just hearsay. Al-Farabi told him, and the answer is, this is the one who added to the book in a later era. And it was put that his speech is a chain of transmission to Al-Bukhari. And then this speech was included by the people of the hadith later, and the book states that as long as the hadith is corroborated by Al-Bukhari, then it is truly his speech as long as it is verified, attributional clause. So basically saying that as long as you heard it from someone, everything's a matter of trust. So as long as you heard it from someone, and this translator, instead of translating the book as a third party, just translating, he became a narrator himself. He became one of the sources instead of him being just a translator. So even the historian Ibn al-Athir discovered this forgery and the situation in Sahih al-Bukhari by saying, on the authority of Al-Humaydi, Abu Mas'ud narrated that Al-Bukhari in a Sahih narrates from the narration of Hussein on the authority of him who said, in the pre-Islamic period, I saw monkeys gathering on where monkeys who had committed fornication. So they stoned them, and I stoned them, and I stoned with them. This is what Abu Mas'ud said. So the man jumped in, stoning the monkeys as the monkeys do. One thing about these chains of narrations and these hadiths and these narrators is really complicated. Why? Because they're confused. It's very complicated because you have so many narrators, so many chains of narration, and then so many different sources, and then approvals what this scholar or this book might approve of, this scholar would not approve of. And what he says is positive, this guy says is negative. So it's a game. So it's like it's a wide field. You could pick and choose whatever you want. Now, they are worse than, let's say, other religious groups. So if you debate or talk with a Jewish man, he will debate you from one book. If you talk or debate with a Christian, he will talk to you from one book. If you talk to a so-called traditional Muslim or any Islamic sect, you cannot hold him to one book. He has like 50 different books from 70 different scholars and so many hadiths and so many narrations. He will argue with you from every book except for the Quran. Except for the Quran, he will argue with any book you want. Why? Because that gives him a field advantage on playing and cherry picking what he wants so he could win, or he could confuse you, even because they are confused themselves. Because in this, let's say in this subject, he could argue that it's a positive, and then maybe years down the road, he could change his mind and argue with the same hadith or different hadiths that this subject is a negative. And it's so confusing. So I just read it out so you can understand how complicated is it, because it's all about hearsay, trust. Nothing evidence, no concrete evidence, nothing logical about it. So, but at the same time, each one is exposing the other. So you could find this group of scholars exposing these couple of other scholars, and then you find these scholars exposing the other scholars, and it's a circle of backstabbings. So that's how it is. I'm just reading it, not for you to really understand it, but just for you just to understand how dumb it is, how complicated it is. So, and this is the story about the monkeys. So this guy say that he saw a bunch of monkeys stoning a monkey, another female monkey or a male monkey. So he jumps in and starts stoning the monkey with the monkeys. So I mean, now the how they write the stories and how they convert stories into hadith or into religious texts is here, because it is mentioned in any place that Al Bukhari included it. Is it mentioned in any place that Al Bukhari included it in his book? So we searched for it and found it in some of them. The abrogation, not all of it, was mentioned in the Days of Ignorance, which is pre-Islamic, not in the narration of Al-Nu'aymi on the authority of Al-Fibri. There is originally something from this narration about monkeys as a story, and perhaps its extra is one of the insertions, which was inserted into the book of Al-Bukhari, and which is Al-Bukhari said in the Great History on the authority of Amr ibn Maymun. He said, in the pre-Islamic period, I saw monkeys gathering on them. They stoned her, and I stoned her with them. It does not contain she committed adultery. If this addition is valid, then it is only Al-Bukhari included as an indication that Amr bin Maymun had realized the pre-Islamic era and did not care, according to what he thought during Al-Jahiliyyah. Jama' al-Usul. That's section 11, 784. And in short words of Ibn al-Athir, the story of adulterous monkeys in Sahih Al Bukhari mentioned in number 3849 on the adultery of Amr bin Maymun is placed in the Sahih and as real. And Al-Bukhari mentioned it in another book without the term adultery, which means that there are signs and evidence for the previous Imams that this situation of forgery occurred in the book, and for the absence of complete information, they were looking for justifications, either for those who quoted from the book or for Imam al-Bukhari himself as a great symbol of the Sunni school religion. They just built on it. They cannot, there's no reverse, there's no correction. If this person, and he's like a demigod, or he's sanctified, they cannot correct him. They have to keep on stepping forward, making from one mistake begets another mistake. And just to see, every story has to be, and based on this story, some scholars legitimize the stoning, the stoning of man and woman, and they always say, if monkeys could do that, why cannot humans do it? If monkeys could apply the law of the Lord, then why cannot humans do it? And that's just proof. Even though there's not even any single mention in the Quran about stoning an adulteress. That was brought on by the Jews, and that's still in the Jewish book. That was brought on by the Jewish people living in Medina with the Prophet. That was part of their cultures, and the Arabs took it on. And later on, then they merged it with the Islamic culture, with the tradition, their Arabic traditional Islamic culture. They merged that stoning, the story of the monkey, as an extra proof, extra evidence that it is there. But they actually got it from the Jews that were in the Medina living with the Prophet, because that's part of their religion, their millah, their way, their rituals, and they brought it on, even though in the Quran it's not there at all. But they got it from the monkeys. And because of the Jews, and they brought it on to the so-called Islamic religion. Well, actually not Islamic, it's actually traditional Sunni religion. Islam has nothing to do with it. If it's not in the Quran, forget about it. Now, fourthly, the stories circulated that Al Bukhari had been hearing hadith for dozens of years in the Middle East. Then he decided to write his comprehensive Sahih on it, and it was looked at from several points of view. Now, one, the stories were circulated by jurists who lived hundreds of years after Al Bukhari, and there is no evidence for them from the contemporaries of Al Bukhari. There's no, how you could say, as they say, no solid train of narration. It's just, the book was just fell from the sky. That's it. Number two, the countries of the Middle East have a dry climate and desert lands with high temperatures. Anyone who has lived in a snowy country can settle there dozens of years to seek knowledge without returning to his original homeland. Al Bukhari was an Uzbek, Turkey, who lived in a snowy climate that witnessed this, and also supported by the Arab traveler Ibn Fadlan in his book. Ibn Fadlan, if anyone has watched the movie The 13th Warrior by Antonio Banderas, The 13th Warrior, that's the character Ahmed bin Fadlan that we're talking about here. He was a traveler and biographer. So this is Ahmed bin Fadlan. It's an old movie, but I loved it. I watched it like 5 times. But that's Ahmed bin Fadlan that this character is. Traveler Ibn Ahmed bin Fadlan in his book, where he presented evidence of snow and its danger winter in the country of Samarkand and Bukhara and the lands of Khawarizm in general, and the confirmation of Yaqut al-Hamawi on the testimony of Ibn Fadlan later in the Dictionary of Countries. And this nature is still the harshest climate conditions until now, knowing that Al-Bukhari era is scientifically calculated within the era of medieval warm, in which the earth was hot from the 9th to the 14th century, Christian era. The Arab countries and the Middle East were very hot, so people who lived in the snow could not stay there for many years. From this angle, we understand why the Mongols refused the invasion of the Arab desert and occupation of Mecca and Medina, and why did they not care about an invasion to Egypt and instead left a small army with Katbuka that was defeated in the Battle of Ain Jalut, and why the Mongols? Why were they more interested in conquering Europe, Russia, Anatolia, and the Middle East, the fertile lands? Why is this timing? And the answer is the Arab desert and Egypt have a very dry climate and harsh desert that the Mongols' army coming from the countries of snow had to bear its heat. And the problem is that History has not mentioned those very good reasons to explain Hulaku's strange behavior, where logic imposed on him that if he refused to invade Egypt, why would he try to attack it with a small army? And through history, we know that he took back most of his army back to his country and left a small enclave. So why would he try to attack it with that small army? And here is a historical void area that puts the possibility that the Egyptian Mamluk army, the victors of this battle, is the one who attacked the Mongol garrisons in Palestine or in the Levante, taking advantage of this, although this probability is weak and there is no historical evidence for it, and that Muslims document a very different story of history. But it is logically accepted to explain what happened, and other history books have not documented it to convey the views of the opposition, the Mongols. What is related to Hulagu's army is also related to Timur's army in the 14th and early 15th century, Timur link. When this Mongol king conquered Central and Minor Asia, Levante, and Iraq, but he did not advance to Egypt and the Arab desert. And Arab historians said that he was afraid of the Egyptian army and the Sultan al-Bahir Barquk. While logic says that from he whom conquered and destroyed the greatest Ottoman, Indian, and Asian armies will not be afraid of the Egyptian army. And Timur links abstinence from entering Cairo and the Hijaz has his reasons related to the acknowledgement of Hulaku from the past. Also, number 3, Al Bukhari assumes that he collected the Sunnah and the Hadith to have a high status in his country of origin, Bukhara. How can he achieve this great achievement in the East? Then his family also refused to return to Samarkand. So he lives at the end of his life as a fugitive. Everyone knows that. And most likely that there is a dispute with his Turkish clan, either due to political factors, because he is close to Al-Mutawakkil, the Khalifa, the Abbasid Khalifa, who was hostile to Ahl al-Bayt, the descendants of the Prophet, from his daughter, Ahl al-Bayt. And his reputation in the countries of the Turks is not good, especially since Al-Mutawakkil's biography tells of conflicts with Turkish leaders who are likely to be revolted against his religious policies or for doctrinal factors in which Al-Bukhari had fallen into jurisprudence and narration errors according to the Hanafi Imams of Samarkand. And for this factor, he inherited from the followers of Al-Hanafi Madhab the famous story of goat's milk, which they said was the reason for his expulsion from their city, which the Hanbalis and the Hadith scholars later denied and considered it a libel of Al-Ahnaf to take revenge on Al-Bukhari after writing Sahih Al in which he attacked the Hanafi Madhab narrations. Number 4, Al-Bukhari was not a writer, but he preserved the way of the people's Hadith and its culture, did not know the codification, and our evidence is that the treasury of the Abbasid court did not contain any books of Al-Bukhari, who was close to the Khalif Al-Mutawakkil. So how could the Khalif order Al-Bukhari to write down and record this? Then these works are not kept in the state library. The only explanation for the absence of any of Al-Bukhari's books from the Abbasid state library for 2 centuries after the death of Al-Bukhari from all the books of Hadith is that the decision to register it came late in an unknown year. It has yet to be determined, but it is circumstances and atmosphere in which at the time the spread fraud and forgery can be imagined. The forged books attributed to the Imams such as Al-Shafi'i, Al-Ash'ari, or Abu Hanifa, and that this systematic forgery occurred regularly between the 4th and 6th centuries after Hijrah. Fifth, number 5. The one who published Sahih Al Bukhari is Imam Al Farbari, as he advanced, and his full name is Muhammad bin Yusuf bin Matar Al Farbari from Turkmenistan. He died in the year 320 after Hijrah, and his birth was in the year 231 after Hijrah. That's Islamic, that's the Arabic calendar, meaning he lived for 89 years, which is a long age that explains the spread of Sahih Al Bukhari on his hands. And he did not follow Al Bukhari, but only 9 years. From puberty of 16 years old to 25 years old, which is the age of Al Farbari when Al Bukhari died in the year 256 after Hijrah. With these simple statistics, Al Farbari continued to publish Sahih Al Bukhari in countries and regions 64 years. For 64 years, he was diligently publishing this. And among the most famous of those who transmitted the Sahih from him to be published by Imam Ibn Shabuya and Abi Zayd al-Maruzi and Al-Qadi al-Jurjani and Abu Muhammad al-Sharqi and others. And all of these scholars or people, they lived in the 4th century after Hijrah, which is the historical period in which it spread to true Al-Bukhari practically. As before this date, he was known only to the elite Abbasid court and the jurists associated with it. That means Al-Bukhari before this date was virtually unknown to the public, only to the elite. And within a narrow societal framework surrounding the circles of the Caliph. So only the top elite knew about him, not the public, because of the circulation, the limitation of the circulation before this Al Farbari came along. Now 6, in Sahih Al Bukhari, there are Zoroastrian and Jewish influences, the presence of which was not noticed in this quantity. Other Arab books, such as Muwatta Malik and his student Imam Muslim, are equal in that. The story of Mi'raj is a Zoroastrian passion, and the stories of the Antichrist and the epics of the end of time are taken from the books of the Jews, just copy and paste, period. If we knew that the Jewish Khazar kingdom was nearby, and Al-Bukhari, and between it and Bukhara, the country of Bukhari, his name Bukhara, and the Khazar between it, and this country have commercial and political relationships and reciprocal migrations, it became clear, in addition to the fact that the Bukhara era witnessed the end of the wars of the Khazars with the Byzantine. So during that time, the Khazars were living probably like north of Bukhara, and they witnessed the end of the wars between the Khazars and Byzantine. And during this time, they converted to Judaism. Then the start of the other wars with the Russians led to mass Jewish migration from the Khazars to the plains of Central Asia, to around Bukhara and Samarkand. And some of them settled in Uzbekistan. And of course, ideas overlapped and stories overlapped, and some quotations took place. And we do not exempt Imam Al-Farbari from these quotations and influence because of his Turkish culture and his closest neighborhood to the Khazars in the land of the Turkmen, nor from those who copied on the authority of Farbari the book Sahih Al-Jami' as the two Imams Abu Zayd al-Marzawi and Ibn Shabuya. So we could see the connection, how these stories came to Al-Bukhari, ended up in Sahih Al-Bukhari, Sahih Al-Jami', because of the influence and the trade of wartime migration or commerce or living or work or whatever it is, and they emerge. And these stories took on from a Jewish characteristics to an traditional Islamic or Arabic characteristic. The Turkmens and the Arab Imam Abu Haytham al Khashmihini, hope I'm pronouncing it right. These names are just very old. Now, in the seventh in heritage, there are narrators on the authority of Al Bukhari other than Al Farbari, but through memorization and indoctrination, Al Shafafi, such as Hamad ibn Shakir al Nasafi, Ibrahim bin Ma'qil al Nasafi, and others not known exactly the methods of documenting these narrations from their sources according to Hamad and Ibrahim, but from whom later narrators claimed that the sons of al-Nasafi quoted al-Bukhari. And this is a major flaw in the methodology of the people of Hadith, where the report is documented by simply trusting the one who said it, not by investigation of the source or thinking about the credibility of the news mentally, which makes that news implicitly conflicting and containing blanks and unanswered questions and contradictions, such as those raised by Professor Muhammad Abu Raya in his book Lights on the Muhammadan Sunnah, where he said that the number of hadiths of al-Bukhari increases in numbers in the narration of al-Farbari over the narrations of Ibrahim bin Ma'qil al-Nasafi by 200, and the number of narration of al-Nasafi exceeds that of Muhammad ibn Shakir al-Nasafi by 100 hadiths. And the immediate question is, what is the fate of those increases and who placed them? Is it possible to document? Well, are these narrations from their source with Hamad and Ibrahim, or will their news be accepted without doubt? And in my opinion, that the occurrence of the inconsistency is natural by virtue of time, and that the likely possibility is that what al-Farbari narrated and some heard it later transformed it into narration as itself from al-Nasafi, because there is a difference. There is a great time between the Nasafis and the first mention of them in the books of heritage, especially since the first mentions of them is Ibrahim ibn Ma'qil al-Nasafi was in the 6th century after Hijrah, through two ways. Judge Ayad, in his book The Lights of Lights on Sahih Al-Athar, and this judge passed away in the year 548 after Hijrah. That is 250 years after the death of Ibrahim ibn Ma'qil al-Nasafi, one of the narrators of al-Bukhari. So where is the mention of al-Nasafi before this time? Noting that Judge Ayad testified that the countries of Al-Maghrib and Andalusia, they only knew two narrations, most of which are from Al-Farbari, who said, as for the comprehensive book, the Musnad, the Sahih of Imam Abi Abdullah Muhammad ibn Ismail al-Bukhari, it has reached us from the narration of Abi Abdullah Muhammad ibn Yusuf al-Farbari, and most of the narration are from his path and from the narration of Ibrahim bin Ma'qil al-Nasafi on the authority of al-Bukhari, and it did not reach us except for those two paths narrated from him, and did not enter Morocco and Andalusia except on his authority due to the large number of narrators narrated by al-Bukhari on him for his book. So we have narrated on the authority of Abu Ishaq al-Mustamili that he said on the authority of Abu Abdullah al-Farbari, he used to say 90,000 men were narrated by the Sahih on the authority of Abu Abdullah, and none of them remained except me. Masharik al-Anwar on Sahih al-Athar. And the question is, why narrations from al-Farbari is more? Isn't it supposed to that the book is one and the narration is one, and that there is consensus on it, on its subject and chain of narrations? And where are the rest of the alleged narrations on the tongue al-Farbari? And what's right? This number carried from Bukhari. This number carried from Bukhari 90,000 hadiths. And what is the authenticity of his lineage to the al-Farbari in the first place? It is permissible for one of the scribes to put it on the tongue of al-Farbari due to the many objections to the book, and at sometimes while intellectual controversy over its documentation was active. Now, Ibn Asakir in the history of Damascus, that is approximately 270 years after the death of An-Nasafi, where Ibrahim An-Nasafi died in 295 after Hijrah. Ibn Asakir died in 571. So how can those who lived before Ibn Asakir be ignorant of a narration of the narration of Ibrahim An-Nasafi for the right of the whole of 3 centuries? If he was such a narrator, this is the whole point right now. This is the punchline. If these guys who write in autobiographies, such as Ibn Asakir and this other Qadi Ayad, were writing the names of the people, of the most famous narrators, had not mentioned them, where were they for the past 3 centuries? They only showed up, they just popped up from the time of whatever they were born, and 300 centuries after, now their names are everywhere. Bukhari, the narration of these persons, An-Nasafi, Ibrahim An-Nasafi, narrated of Bukhari. Where were they before that? So it was just planting. They were just planting names just to give authenticity for the book of Bukhari. In addition, Ibrahim An-Nasafi was a Hanafi school. So how does he narrate Sahih Al Bukhari, who challenges his belief, and because of what he said, and Hanafis expelled him from Bukhara? Because it is known that Bukhari wrote negative things about Hanafi school, and this guy was a Hanafi. So how can he narrate from him in the first place? So, like I said, the reason I'm narrating these quotes from different scholars, just to show you how confusing it is and how much just nonsense it is. They just add in as they go along. They just add in and patch in as they go along. So just like download a patch for a program. Just if something is messed up here, let's just put this guy's name in here. Let's patch it up. No one's gonna know. But here we are. The answer is, it was during the time of the empowerment of Ash'ari and Maturidi after the document of Al-Qadir Billah in the 5th century after Hijrah. Now this is a whole different story. It happened that many forged books appeared. So what happened, attributed that Hanafi narration to Sahih Al Bukhari, confirming the Hanafis as an authentic school for Abbasid Khalifa, who was and still supports this right from the era of Mutawakkil, because Hanafis at the beginning did not believe in hadith. They would not narrate from hadith. They would narrate from a different source, which is from the Quran and thinking. So they kind of forced this idea that they narrated hadith just to get him in with them. They just stuck that belief onto them. So they were attributing the Hanafi narration to Sahih al-Bukhari, confirming the Hanafis as an authentic school for the Abbasid Khalif, who was and still supports this right from the era of al-Mutawakkil. As the other narration of Hamad ibn Shakir al-Nasafi is based on Ja'far ibn Muhammad bin al-Mu'taz al-Mustaghfari. In his book, The History of Nasf, written at the beginning of the 5th century after Hijrah, after Bukhari died at least 200 years ago, that there is no real mention of it in history except from the path of al-Mustaghfari. And this poses a major problem in the methodology of writing Islamic history, especially hadith books. For the later narrators used to attribute works to themselves and their sheikhs without documentation and a complete transmission of the backwardness of this era in terms of science and suspicion of a sect, the hadith narrators. Knowing that this era was witnessing a parallel great scientific and philosophical renaissance, it took place in other countries as a result of political and politics and the separation of Shia's countries from the center of the Abbasids Caliphate in Baghdad. So every country had its own renaissance and own books. And so what books you find in the Shia countries, you're not going to find in the Sunni countries, and they each attack and accuse each other of it's just a war. And what al-Mustaghfiri did in reality is that if he ascribed a book to a jurist that lived in the 18th century without anyone who lived over the past 300 years knowing about it, nor do I know how this point is absent from the hadith scholars who transmitted the narration of al-Mustaghfiri in documenting the narration of Hamad on the authority of Sahih Al It appears from that presentation that the book of Farbari, Sahih Al was documented with allegations of the personality of Al-Bukhari, who lived in the 3rd century after Hijrah, either at the hands of Al-Farbari himself or at the hands of later Imams who faced a dilemma. Great in documenting the book until they exaggerated lies and invented the number of narration that reached 90,000. And logic says that exaggeration is evidence of lies and evidence of health. This is a large number. The alleged is based on the fact that the book Al-Farbari, attributed to Al-Bukhari with the name Sahih Al was widespread in Central Asia and Khorasan before the Abbasid Khalifa Al-Mutawakkil in God used it in his war against the people of opinion. This is a different sect. For Al-Mutawakkil was not only an enemy of the Shiites, but for all the sects and the people of opinion from the Mu'tazila and the Hanafis, and the works of Al-Bukhari worked in this framework with other Imams, such as Ibn Hanbal, Al-Tayalisi, and Ibn Abi Shaybah. And others, even though who followed Al-Mutawakkil, did not depart from his sunnah by adhering to this line, which means that Al-Bukhari book was the guideline, was the rails like the train rails. You cannot go out of that. You cannot expand. Which in the war against Shi'ism, Mu'tazila, and people of opinion, and that the policy remained until the Khalifa Al-Qadir by God, in 408 after Hijrah, to impose an official document that crowned what Al-Mutawakkil had done, to become a constitution for the Abbasid state and not permissible to break it. Now, number 8, finally. What happened with Al-Bukhari regarding Al-Farbari's monopoly over his ideas and narration happened with Al-Bukhari Muslim as the only narrator of his. Let me just clarify what happened to. Let me clarify that. What happened to Al-Bukhari regarding to Al-Farbari's monopoly over his ideas and narration happened with Muslim. There's another book, Imam Muslim. As the only narrator of his Sahih is a person named Abu Ishaq ibn Sufyan al-Mazawi. Hence, Sahih Muslim becomes Sahih al-Mazawi in reality. And it bears witness to that is the Salafi al-Wahhabi Sheikh Salih al-Sheikh in his book Explanation of the Wasatiyah Creed said, as for Muslim, this is about Imam Muslim, his name is Muslim, not Muslims as in the worshippers, the people, the enslaved. Is just, we're talking about Muslim. His name is Muslim. The first one is Imam Bukhari. This guy is Imam Muslim. May God have mercy on him. His authentic book was narrated from him only by one person, and he is Ibn Sufyan. may God have mercy on him, as I quote, and he narrated on his authority in most of the book, and he misheard it or did not read Muslim from the narrator in 3 places, and he did not hear them from Muslim at all. So these are 2 men who are working behind the scenes in the name of the original authors, either replaced, misplaced, or just wrote it from their minds. These 3 large places, some of the places came, some of these places subjects came on 20 to 30 pages. The narration, some of them came to 20 to 30 pages, and he only has it as one narration because Muslim did not find it easy for him to read his book before his death, but chose from it. He passed away before he recited it, but Ibn Sufyan narrated on his own. And the abbreviation and the abbreviated words of Salih al-Sheikh that Sahih Muslim came from only one person, Ibn Sufyan. So it is known in other translations by Abu Ishaq ibn Sufyan al-Marzawi, and that it was narrated by the Sahih orally and not written. As for those who copied Sahih Muslim, they were the students of Ibn Sufyan al-Marzawi. Hence, the Imam Muslim did not write a book and did not hold a pen. So, who is the one who wrote a Sahih current Muslim who is in our hands, which is called Sahih Muslim? That one is Sahih Bukhari, the Sahih Muslim. In addition to the Sheikh's recognition that the only copy Sahih Muslim is missing from 20 to 30 pages. And this is a direct evidence that the addition and the omission is included in Sahih Muslim as well as it entered on Al Bukhari, and that the Sahih that's in our hands is not the one who wrote it or narrated by his first compiler, but rather went through an era of adjustment and additions at later times. But Judge Ayad has another opinion regarding the number of narration by Muslim. He said, as for the book of Musnad al-Sahih al-Mukhtasar, by transmission from the Messenger of God, peace be upon him, to Imam Abu Hussein Muslim ibn al-Hajjaj of the Qushayri lineage, from Naysaburi ad-Dar, from the village or the country is called Naysabur, for it has reached us from 2 narration, also the narration of Abu Ishaq Ibrahim ibn Sufyan al-Marzawi, and the narration of Abu Muhammad Ahmad bin Ali al-Kallani, except that the end of it is from the chapter, the hadith of Ifk was not heard by Ibn Mahan except from Ibn Sufyan. So the narration was unique from there on the authority of Sufyan, because this is where the narration of Abu Bakr ibn al-Ashqar Ali al-Qalansi ended and did not reach us without these 2 narrations. Masharik al-Anwar on Sahih al-Athar. I really didn't want to read all this garbage, but this narration, he said, she said, just to show how confusing it is. Here are some of the questions. Why does Sheikh Salih al-Sheikh does not believe narrations by al-Kallani Marwazi? Although the Sheikh's motivations are mentioned in the following text, that the single narration of Sahih Muslim exempt him from disputes and suspicions about abrogation. But this saying has not treated the origin of the problem, is that the authentication of Sahih Muslim has a problem, and that what we have in the truth is the saying of Al-Marzawi, famous in the name of Sahih Muslim, and the other saying of Al-Qalansi are not recognized by contemporary Salafism. So what exactly did Muslims say or attribute to him in Al-Qalansi's narration? Is it not possible that this narration included hadiths and strange things that destroyed the doctrine of the Sunni religion and the constants of contemporary Salafism? Isn't that rejected narration already included myths and gross violations of the Quranic text and the mind despite the legitimacy of that questions. But the elders absolve themselves from answering and prefer the easiest behavior, always without entering into the important details that may destroy the origin of their private religion. So basically, we just basically talking about all this he said, she said, and documentary. We could show that it was just basically patches. One guy started it, and this group, the Salafis, needed a book to confer to. So because Imam al-Shafi'i started a religion, and they needed a book, a center. They can't use the Quran because the Quran is too truthful for them. They cannot twist. They cannot erase the book or change it, but they could change the meaning. But it's very hard. So what they do is that they needed a book. They needed the authenticity of the Prophet. So when Bukhari came along, voila, there it is. They needed this Al Bukhari and Muslim to replace the Quran. So how they do that? They change the center of religion from the Quran to the so-called Sunnah. And what is the Sunnah? It's the Bukhari and Muslim books. So what they do is that the laws and restriction was very lax. So all they had to do was just patch it up. Just patch it up and make up names and erase names, and all these lies will show up through other writers, independent writers, because the main thing is that how we came nowadays to see all these holes like Swiss cheese and contradiction is because back then, when a writer will write a book, he'll be in a different country, and every book was not printed. They didn't have no printing press, so every book has to be multi-copied, had to be hand copied. So when they would write the Bukhari, somebody else would write something else, and they would later on in the 21st century, we could see all the contradiction, we could see all the playing the games. Because of what? Because we have them all at one time. We could spread all these books at one line, one time. But back then they couldn't. And even if they heard it, but they couldn't gather it, and they would, at the same time, they would deny this book or deny this line or accuse this author of being so-and-so and attack his character, but nothing at the same time. So now we could see all the contradictions. But we're talking about over 300 years. Let's say that these writers write about some person after 300 years. But before 300 years, he was not mentioned. He was unknown, virtually unknown. But for this person to be in the book of Bukhari for 300 years, and it's the most famous book after the Quran, and not known until 300 years later when this person writes about him. So he was added on later on. He was added into later on because he was one of those patches. And that's what happens. That's why I am happy, I'm glad I don't belong to any sect, any denomination. I'm not a slave. I'm a free man. I follow the Quran only. I don't follow hadith. I don't follow the fake, this invented sunnah. I don't follow any of that. I follow my mind, the Quran, the same way the Prophet did. That's it. He read the Quran, he understood it, and he did it. And I do the same thing. I'm not a slave. I'm a free man. But I'm reading for the other poor souls. Hopefully they could get a little glimpse. Maybe from this whole article that I read, maybe 2-3 lines would get through the head. And maybe you would start thinking about it. And that's what I had to say and read. And I'm trying to do my best. But this is what I have. So thank you for following. This is Quranomics. I'm Qadi Tayyib Azdi. And we'll see you again.